So I'm going to be very brief so that we have as much time as possible with Zia Khan. It's great to see everybody. As Joanne and maybe Mary Rose also mentioned, we'll just call him Zia because he says Dr. Khan is his father. Zia joined the Rockefeller Foundation in 2009 as Vice President for Initiatives and Strategies. Essentially, that means he oversees all the programmatic work in New York and internationally. The foundation also has offices in Bangkok and Nairobi. And looking at what they term searching for new opportunities, developing strategies, and executing initiatives, which you could basically say is reflect, innovate, impact. Before Rockefeller, Zia was a management consultant who was a partner at Booz & Company, and before that worked at Katz & Back and actually interviewed and recruited here at SOM. He's a co-author of a book called Leading Outside the Lines, and is a graduate of Cornell as well as an MS and PhD from Stanford. So, Zia, please.
Thank you very much, Tony. Good morning, and thank you, Tony, for that kind introduction, and also thanks to the organizers of such an interesting conference and the School of Management for hosting it. To give this talk at Yale is fitting because one of the themes of my talk is around partnership, and the Rockefeller Foundation has been partnering with Yale for many, many years. We help to fund its inquiry into disciplines such as nursing, urban design, drama, and psychology. And we even issued the grant that brought Ralph Ellison, the author of Invisible Man, to Yale as a visiting fellow in the fall of 1964. But I'm not here to remind Yale University how much money the Rockefeller Foundation has given it. I'm here to talk about the cycle of reflect, innovate, and impact. And I'm really excited to share with you some of the ideas and how they apply to the work that we do at the Rockefeller Foundation and how it helps us realize our mission. And what I'm about to share with you is really grounded in my experience working in a number of different areas. I started doing some academic research, then worked as a strategy consultant in the private sector, and now work on strategy and execution in the social sector. And each of these sectors have different ways of reflecting, innovating, and driving impact. So hopefully, you all know by now there is no prescription for reflect, innovate, and impact. But there are always useful ideas that you can draw from one sector and apply to another. And my goal today, in my talk right now, is to share some of those ideas with some actual examples of work that we are doing. But before I go into those topics, so that you have context, let me give you some brief background on the Rockefeller Foundation. Our mission, which has remained the same for 101 years, is to promote the well-being of humanity throughout the world. And today we pursue this mission with two goals. First, advancing inclusive economies so that we can expand opportunities for more people to share in global prosperity. And second, building resilience for people, institutions, communities, and cities so that they can prepare for, withstand, and adapt and survive the acute shocks and the chronic stresses that we are increasingly facing today. So with partners and grantees, we try and drive big change. We aspire to create transformations and fundamental differences in the status quo. Over the course of our history, we've been fortunate to have introduced many innovations that have helped billions of people. And these include creating the field of public health, launching the green revolution in agriculture, and more recently, catalyzing the field of impact investing to mobilize investment capital for both financial and social returns. And what's been a real benefit, as I have a little bit of a history buff in me, is that there have been detailed records kept for the past 101 years, and we keep detailed records right now. And that really allows us to look back on our history, learn what worked, what didn't work. And it's surprising how constant the themes are and how, although the world has certainly changed in 100 years, the approach to driving social change really hasn't changed that much. And fundamental to our approach over the past 100 years has been what we call a systems approach. How do we look at the whole system, find the root causes of problems, address those root causes, and reorganize partnerships and introduce innovations so that they can infiltrate the entire system and create a big change. And let me illustrate this with one of our successes, one of the earliest successes of the Rockefeller Foundation, almost 100 years ago, which was to eradicate hookworm. In the early 20th century, unknown to many, hookworm was sapping the energy and health of countless school children in rural parts of the southern United States. In some areas, infection rates were as high as 60%. There were some medical researchers who had discovered a hookworm vaccine, and they came to the foundation to discuss it with program officers. The staff recognized that this could be an opportunity, but they also knew that this innovation, the vaccine, was just part of the solution. The eventual eradication of the disease depended on taking a broad and comprehensive system approach, stepping back to look at all the factors and using a range of tools and strategies to attack the problem from many angles. So for example, one of the broader system issues was a cultural issue. In how would communities receive these Northern Rockefeller Foundation staff showing up to fix their children? This wasn't very long after the US Civil War, and there was still tension between the North and the South, where most of the hookworm infections were occurring. And as staff reflected on this issue, they realized that they would have to engage communities with new tools and new methods. They proactively engaged newspaper editors, local political officials, and they even took this new invention of film at the time and created some of the very first public service announcements. So that's an example of how, in our work, we try and think very broadly about all the tools and influences that might be at the core of a problem, which you may think is just getting children inoculated with a vaccine. So from these and many other examples, we learned a few important lessons. First, we work on very difficult and complex problems. And these problems demand reflection along the way because they can never be initially understood comprehensively or completely. And so we have to figure out how we continue reflecting and learning, because sometimes you don't even know what the problem is until you start solving it. And in fact, with this hookworm example, the initial problem they were working on was improving education. And it was when they started to spend time in the schools that they noticed that there were a set of children who were much smaller than others, and that led them to discover that hookworm was actually a root cause of what was perceived to be an education problem. Second, for any innovation to have scale, you need to create new partnerships. And they created lots of partnerships in this hookworm example between public media, local health boards, local political officials, communities, and medical researchers. And we believe in our work that we always have to think about the system and create some form of partnerships, usually between government, the private sector, and the social sector, in addition to communities and the beneficiaries we're trying to help. So let's fast forward to today, and let me share with you an example of some current work. We just launched an initiative this past summer to address the problem of energy poverty in rural India. There are hundreds of millions of people in rural India who do not have access to electricity, leading to many negative problems and consequences on health, education, and the ability to earn a livelihood. So what we have done is come up with a new innovation and a model. And it's laid out here. I'll describe it briefly. At the center of this model is what we call an integrated experiment, what happens when you work at scale. It would be enough so that the policymakers could see it as reasonable, and it would be enough so that we could globally talk about this as a general approach for how to address the problem in other parts of the world. So the 1,000 villages is our North Star, and that's probably our most fixed goal. And then we'll set ourselves some metrics for, okay, so what does the economic viability of these plants need to look like? What are some of the social leading indicators? I gave a few examples of how many hours children are studying, surveys of how women are feeling about their degrees of freedom, et cetera. And then what are some of the environmental metrics that we want to capture as well in terms of the number of gallons of diesel fuel? So we try and think of what are the major outcomes in the system that we're trying to realize, and what are the associated metrics, and we just cascade those down. The more granular ones tend to be more operational execution metrics to just make sure we're tracking according to our plan, and the higher level indicators are the ones that really inform whether we have the right strategy or not. So we originally thought that we would get telecom companies to sign up for these contracts in that system. It turns out that that's not happening, but we can work with energy partners who already have those contracts. And we can pivot on that in a few months as opposed to a more traditional approach, one of our more traditional approaches where we'd wait 3 years for a midterm evaluation before we made a change.
And you elegantly sidestepped the issue of exiting.
Exiting, yes. Freudian slip. Exiting is never easier and never easy. But I actually think if we can set a goal clearly up front of what we're trying to accomplish, when we accomplish it, no one should be that surprised that we're exiting. So in this case, we will probably declare some form of victory after the 1,000 villages. I'm sure there's some wrap-up work we'll be doing, but I don't think anyone should be terribly surprised that we're not continuing to another 2,000 villages. We have had some problems exiting some other areas where it wasn't clear exactly to others where we were going to fix the endpoint, and then through some very strategic decision making that we have to make internally around where our resources are best deployed, we'll make a decision to exit. And that it is tricky in the sector because there are lots of people who base their plans on expectations of funding or are dependent on the continued funding or involvement of the foundation. We always try and provide some tie-off funding for that, but that always is a difficult situation.
So one of question from our participants. You discussed the importance of partnerships. Can you share what you find to be the greatest, most typical risks to avoid when creating a partnership across sectors in order to ensure they're effective?
So partnerships, I think, is probably the thing that everyone agrees is useful to do and probably one of the hardest things to actually execute. And I think one of the problems with partnerships is that people feel they have to do the same thing or they have to commit to the same approach. And something that I've been learning more about through reflecting and talking more about is actually partners can be very different and make very different contributions, but still collectively achieve a goal. And that's often an easier way to partner because you're not asking people to change what they do. So for example, in the case of the smart power, the rural electrification, we're not asking the tower companies, the telecom tower companies, to actually care about the social outcomes. We just want them to focus on lowering their costs, and we think that our model will help them lower their costs. And so I think the way I visualize partnerships is how can we stitch together a quilt where every patch is a different partner's objectives and every patch is a different partner's core competencies. And we're not asking them to change, but somehow we're cleverly coordinating them all so they can realize a goal that none of them could have realized on their own.
On the partnership thread, but moving beyond it, how do you motivate, educate funders to have the patience to invest in systemic change and include beneficiaries in the partnership?
So that's kind of a meta question because maybe it's applying to myself as well. Systemic change takes a long time. And different foundations and funders will have different strategies around that. Some will pick a thematic area and just stick with it for many, many years. Our approach is to think about how can we focus on where we can make the biggest difference on a catalytic tipping point that's a powerful demonstration to others and set the ball rolling. And in many ways, that's what we did with impact investing. So people were working on impact investing before it had a name for many, many years. There was a certain energy and coalescing of people's thinking, particularly in the financial crisis, that there were different ways to invest money. We know that the millennials, and there's going to be huge transfers of wealth from one generation to another, and the new generation thought more about social impact. So it felt like a good time to do something. We had a convening where we pulled together leading thinkers, coined the term impact investing, funded some research, funded some organizing groups like the Global Impact Investing Network. We did some pilots of impact investing ourselves, and the momentum really started to take off. That's when we thought our role was over, because we have to be very conscious of the fact we don't have very many dollars, but we have very precious dollars, in that we don't have to earn a return. We can be very flexible in how we deploy it. So we could have kept funding impact investing, but I don't think there was a need for us to do so. And we're very excited about how quickly that agenda has been taken up by different universities, by different governments, and even other funders. And I have to say, sometimes, I had this quote written up on my board that was written about 50 years ago. And it basically says to the effect that sometimes it's hard to step out of the limelight and let others carry the show forward. But in that case, it really, and we're still involved in it, but it really was the right decision for us.
I think these people must have been sitting together because the questions weave together. So can you talk a bit about Rockefeller's use of program-related investments? And I would actually add also mission-related investments where you've really push the envelope. And how is that a tool for innovation in philanthropy?
So program-related investments are a very interesting tool for us. And basically, for those who don't know much about them, foundations often will operate by making grants, which is you fund a project and you have a proposal and has some goals. Or you can make an actual investment in an organization where you earn a return. And for tax code reasons, you're allowed to earn a return as a foundation on it as long as the primary purpose of the investment is not for profit, but that the social outcome is primary. Because if the primary outcome is for profit, then you're doing it from your endowment basically, and it's taxed differently. So the real benefit of program investments are twofold. First of all, you're investing in the organization as an entity rather than as a project. So you're really building their capacity and you're building their ability to execute. So it works differently in that sense. But more importantly, it is almost a signal of confidence in the organization. And it is a way for them to attract other funding and other investors who may require a higher return, but they can afford to give them the higher return because they're giving us a lower return. So I'll give you one example. There's an organization called Cloud Factory. We have a whole initiative on creating digital jobs for youth in Africa. And this organization, Cloud Factory, provides online work for disadvantaged youth. And they were based in Nepal and they wanted to move into Africa. So instead of giving them a grant, they asked us to make a program-related investment. So, we did our due diligence, and the whole process is a little different, and decided to make an investment. Well, they were able to go to other funders and investors, more importantly, and say, the Rockefeller Foundation has not given us a grant to execute. They have so much confidence in what we're going to do that they've invested their money in us, and we're going to pay them back. That, they said, or that's what they tell me, was a completely different conversation to have with other funders and other investors. So in many ways, it creates confidence in the organization, and also it can mobilize other funding in a way that grant funding doesn't.
I feel like we're just getting going, but I've been given the signal that it's time to stop. So thank you very much for coming and for getting us on such a good start.
Thank you.
Sorry we couldn't get to more of your questions, but you have a full day to explore them here. So where do we go from here, Sally?
I suppose we exit off.
All right. Thank you, Tony and Zia, for this very enlightful conversation, and thank you for all the thoughtful questions. So I'm Sally. I'm one of the co-chairs of this year's conference. And before we all proceeding to the coffee break, I do want to highlight the lineup for the rest of the day. So in the morning, starting from 11 o'clock, we will have the Reflect panel, learning from business models, happening in this room. We will have the Innovate workshop, how to create a culture of change, happening in the Beinecke Terrace on the second floor right above us. We will have the Impact panel, increasing effectiveness through collaboration in classroom 4410, which is on the fourth floor. And during lunchtime, you can join Ms. Nancy Fund for a fireside chat on impact investing and its implications to philanthropy, or grab your lunch networking with your peer attendees in any of the classrooms or breakout rooms that are reserved for YPC. And in the afternoon, we will have the Art of Storytelling workshop, the example of an incentiveness panel, and the data-driven decision-making panel. At 3:15, we will all be coming back to this room. We will be joined by Mr. Michael Smith from the White House for the afternoon keynote. I do want to call your attention. We're going to hand out this blank postcards in each of the sessions, and we encourage you to write down your takeaway from the session or a great quote that you really want to remember. We're just doing it very old-fashioned way, and we're going to mail these postcards to you during the summer to remind you what a great day you had in this cold February day, and get registered for next year. Again, to give you a little bit of tips of navigating this giant building, There are staircases located on 4 corners on each floor. If you prefer to use an elevator, after you leave this auditorium, make a left turn, and our wonderful volunteers will give you direction to the elevator. And also to avoid congestion, we do encourage you to use the coffee stations that is closest to the session that you're going to attend. So we have coffee breaks set up right outside this room, well, actually, where you had breakfast. On the first floor, there is coffee set up inside the Beinecke room on the 2nd floor, and there is also set up on the 4th floor outside 4410. So just making sure, leave enough time to get to your room. The next session will start at 11 o'clock, and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.